A sudden darkness falls upon an ancient battlefield, halting armies in their tracks. This is the story of how natural phenomena decided the fate of empires. We will explore legendary events where the sun stood still, storms obliterated fleets, and plagues crippled armies, revealing the sky itself as a decisive weapon. You will understand history not just through the lens of human strategy, but through the uncontrollable power of the natural world. How did a single eclipse end a 5-year war? What mysterious force saved Japan from a massive invasion? By the end, you will see the past in a completely new light, where nature was the ultimate game changer. What do you think it felt like to see the heavens turn against you? The battlefield at Gibeon was shrouded in the deep blue of approaching night, a dangerous time for any army caught mid-pursuit. As the Amorite enemy fled, Joshua faced a terrible dilemma. To stop now would allow them to regroup and fight another day. In a moment of desperate clarity, he did not ask for more soldiers or better weapons. He looked to the sky and commanded the sun and moon to stand still, and according to the ancient text they obeyed. The sun halted in the middle of the heavens and did not hurry to set for about a full day. This was not just a victory, it was a spectacle that reshaped the entire region's understanding of power. For Joshua's forces, it was a divine guarantee, a surge of morale that turned a tactical advance into an unstoppable rout. For the Amorites, it was sheer psychological terror, a fundamental breakdown of the natural order they relied upon. The very rhythm of the world, the predictable setting of the sun, had betrayed them. This story raises a profound question that has echoed for millennia. What actually happened over Gibeon? Modern scholars have proposed several fascinating theories, moving beyond the literal miracle without dismissing the powerful reality of the event. One compelling idea is that a unique atmospheric phenomenon, perhaps a rare type of solar halo or an extraordinary refraction of light, created the illusion that daylight was being prolonged. The sun itself did not stop, but its light behaved in a way that was utterly alien to every witness. Another scientific approach involves retrocalculation, using advanced astronomy to map the positions of celestial bodies thousands of years ago. Some researchers have pinpointed a potential date for the battle and suggest a total solar eclipse occurred, an event that could have been interpreted as the sun dying and then being revived, effectively extending the conflict. Yet others view the account as powerful poetry, a metaphorical way of saying that the Israelite army fought with such relentless energy and divine favor that it was as if the day itself had been lengthened for them. Regardless of the precise mechanics, the core truth remains unshaken. Those who fought that day believed the cosmos intervened on their behalf. This perceived divine intervention became a weapon more potent than any sword, cementing the Battle of Gibeon as a foundational legend. It stands as a timeless example of how a celestial event, real or perceived, could utterly dismantle an enemy's will to fight while forging an unbreakable spirit in another. For the armies of the ancient world, the sky was not a passive backdrop but an active, communicating participant in human affairs. A sudden eclipse was not a mere astronomical coincidence, it was a direct message from the gods. An unexpected storm was a divine warning or a show of favor. This belief system was the very fabric of reality, and military commanders were perhaps its most attentive readers. Before any major battle, from the plains of Mesopotamia to the hills of Rome, generals consulted with seers and priests, seeking to decipher the will of the cosmos. They practiced augury, interpreting the flight patterns of birds, or extispecie, examining the entrails of sacrificed animals for signs. A liver that looked healthy and unblemished could send an army marching forward with supreme confidence. A flock of birds flying in an inauspicious direction could halt an entire legion in its tracks. This was not superstition, it was strategic intelligence gathered from the divine realm. The Roman army, for instance, maintained a college of augurs whose readings were legally binding on military decisions. Imagine the immense psychological pressure on a commander who, moments before a clash, receives a bad omen. His troops who share his belief would be seized with a primal fear, their morale shattered before a single spear is thrown. Conversely, a favorable sign was like a surge of supernatural adrenaline, convincing soldiers they were invincible, that the gods themselves marched in their ranks. This is the crucial context for understanding an event like the sun standing still at Gibeon. In a world where the celestial and the earthly were intimately linked, such a phenomenon was the ultimate omen. It was not just a strange light in the sky, it was a decisive, unambiguous declaration of divine support for one side and utter abandonment for the other. The battle was won not merely by human hands, but by this perceived shift in the cosmic balance. This deep-seated belief in omens forces us to reconsider the very nature of ancient warfare, where strategy and spirituality were fused into a single, powerful weapon. 5 years of brutal war had drained the resources and will of two mighty empires. The Lydians and the Medes were locked in a stalemate along the banks of the Halys River, their soldiers weary from a conflict with no end in sight. Then, on a specific afternoon in the year 585 BCE, the world went dark in the middle of the day. The sun, the very symbol of power and life, was devoured by a black disk, leaving only a faint, ghostly corona in a twilight sky. Day had become night in a matter of minutes. For the soldiers on that field, this was not a scientific event, it was a direct, terrifying message. Both armies interpreted the total solar eclipse as a clear sign from their gods, a divine command that the fighting must stop. In a stunning moment of unity born from sheer terror, they threw down their weapons. The battle was over not by force of arms but by the shadow of the moon. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded this incredible event, noting that it did not just stop the battle, it ended the entire war. The two kings, Alyattes of Lydia and Cyaxares of Media, were so shaken by this celestial intervention that they negotiated a lasting peace, even sealing it with a royal marriage. What makes the Battle of Halys so compelling for modern historians is that science can now pinpoint the exact event that so terrified those ancient armies. Through retrocalculation, astronomers have confirmed that a total solar eclipse swept across that very region of Anatolia on May 28, 585 BCE. The precision of this astronomical data is breathtaking, validating an ancient narrative that might otherwise be dismissed as mere legend. This was not a metaphor or a myth. It was a real, observable astronomical phenomenon that directly altered human history. The sky itself acted as the ultimate diplomat, imposing a truce where human negotiators had failed for half a decade. It is a powerful reminder that for our ancestors, the universe was not a silent void, but an active, speaking presence. Their belief in its messages gave a simple shadow the power to forge a peace treaty, demonstrating that nature could be the most decisive general on any battlefield. While celestial omens could halt a battle on land, the open sea offered no such warnings. Here, nature's fury arrived with a terrifying immediacy, capable of annihilating entire fleets in a single, brutal stroke. In the late 13th century, the island nation of Japan faced its greatest existential threat. Kublai Khan, the formidable ruler of the Mongol Yuan dynasty, had set his sights on its conquest, dispatching a colossal invasion fleet reportedly carrying nearly 40,000 seasoned warriors. For the outmatched Japanese defenders, the sight of this vast armada on the horizon must have been a vision of certain doom. Yet, as the Mongol ships closed in on the coast, the weather changed. The sky darkened, the winds began to howl, and the sea itself rose up. A typhoon of unprecedented, almost mythical force smashed into the Mongol fleet. Wooden vessels were shattered into splinters against the rocky shoreline, and thousands of soldiers were swallowed by the churning waves. The invasion was utterly obliterated. To the grateful Japanese, this was no mere storm. It was a kamikaze, a divine wind, a direct intervention from the gods to protect their sacred homeland. This event was not just a military reprieve, it became a cornerstone of Japanese national identity, reinforcing a belief in their divine favor that would endure for centuries. This phenomenon was not unique to the Pacific. Centuries earlier, in the Mediterranean, the mighty Persian Empire under King Xerxes had assembled an enormous armada to crush the Greek city-states. As this vast fleet sailed towards a decisive engagement at Salamis, it was struck by a violent storm. The Greeks, watching from the relative safety of their shores, saw the tempest as a gift from the gods. The storm did not just damage the Persian ships, it scattered them, disrupting their formations and drowning countless sailors. This meteorological intervention severely weakened the Persian navy just before the historic battle, handing the Greeks a critical advantage they would exploit to secure a legendary victory. In both cases, a sudden, violent shift in the weather acted as the ultimate strategic wildcard. It demonstrated that no matter how many soldiers an empire could muster, no matter how brilliant its generals, a single storm could render all that power utterly meaningless. The weather was an impartial, unpredictable, and utterly devastating participant in warfare, a force that could defend a nation or destroy an empire without a single human hand drawing a sword. The deadliest enemy is often the one you cannot see. While storms and eclipses announced their arrival with terrifying spectacle, a far more insidious force was gathering within the walls of Athens. The city was at the peak of its power, a cultural and military beacon locked in a grueling war with its rival, Sparta. To secure its population, the Athenian leader Pericles ordered a risky strategy, pulling people from the countryside behind the city's massive long walls. This created a defensive fortress, but it also created a perfect breeding ground for catastrophe. Into this overcrowded, unsanitary environment, a silent killer arrived. It was a plague, a disease so virulent and strange that it would cripple an empire from the inside out. We are fortunate to have a chillingly clinical account from the historian Thucydides, who survived the sickness himself. He describes symptoms that started with a sudden, intense fever and a burning inflammation of the eyes and throat. This quickly progressed to violent coughing and sneezing, followed by painful stomach cramps and relentless vomiting. The body would break out in small pustules and ulcers. Perhaps most terrifying was the psychological effect. Thucydides writes that many victims, in their desperate thirst, would throw themselves into water cisterns, and a profound amnesia seized others who survived, leaving them unable to recognize even their closest friends and family. The social fabric of Athens unraveled completely. Law and order broke down as people, believing they had only days to live, abandoned all restraint, pursuing immediate pleasures and ignoring sacred burial rites. Corpses lay in the streets and temples, a horrifying sight that crushed the spirit of the living. The military consequences were immediate and devastating. The plague killed perhaps a quarter of the entire Athenian population, including its visionary leader, Pericles. His death left a vacuum of competent leadership, paving the way for reckless demagogues who would make disastrous strategic decisions in the years to come. The army and navy, decimated by the disease, lost their veteran core and could no longer sustain their aggressive campaigns, but the damage went deeper than mere numbers. The plague shattered the Athenian psyche. Why had their gods, particularly Apollo, the god of healing, allowed this to happen? The perceived divine abandonment eroded the collective will to fight, creating a deep-seated pessimism that lingered long after the sickness had passed. This invisible foe did what the mighty Spartan army could not, permanently weakening Athens and altering the entire balance of power in ancient Greece. It forces us to expand our view of nature's role in warfare beyond the dramatic events in the sky. The very air a soldier breathes can become a battlefield, and the smallest microbe can topple a civilization. Far beneath the placid surface of the Aegean Sea, a pressure was building that would redefine the ancient world. Around the year 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini, exploded with a force unmatched in human history. The eruption was cataclysmic, ejecting cubic miles of rock and ash into the atmosphere and triggering tsunamis that radiated outward at terrifying speeds. For the brilliant Minoan civilization on Crete, just 70 miles to the south, this was not a distant rumble but an existential crisis. The tsunamis would have smashed into their coastal cities and ports, devastating their formidable navy, the very source of their economic and military power. Then a rain of volcanic ash began to fall, blanketing farmlands and choking the life out of their agriculture. While the exact timeline is still debated by historians and archaeologists, a compelling theory suggests this geological catastrophe did not instantly destroy the Minoans but critically weaken them. Their society, built on maritime trade and sophisticated agriculture, was left vulnerable. Within a few generations, their mainland rivals, the Mycenaean Greeks, moved in. The Mycenaeans, hardened by a more militaristic culture, likely found a once great power in a state of irreversible decline, and they seized the opportunity for conquest. The collapse of the Minoan thalassocracy, or Sea Empire, may have been finalized by human hands, but it was set in motion by the fury of the earth itself. This pattern of geological upheaval reshaping human destiny repeated itself 2,000 years later on an even wider scale. In the year 536 CE, the sky across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia began to dim. A mysterious dust veil, now believed by scientists to be the result of a massive volcanic eruption, perhaps in Iceland or North America, shrouded the planet. The sun shone with a dull, feeble light even at midday, and temperatures plummeted. This was the beginning of the year without a summer. For farmers, it was a nightmare. Frosts and snows fell in July and August, destroying harvests across the globe. The result was universal crop failure, followed by devastating famine and disease. The Eastern Roman Empire, under the rule of Emperor Justinian, was hit especially hard. Justinian had been in the midst of an ambitious campaign to reconquer the Western Roman territories, but his armies and the tax base that supported them were now crippled by starvation and the bubonic plague that spread in the famine's wake. The great migrations of peoples desperate to find food and land put immense new pressure on the empire's borders, leading to increased conflicts that it could no longer effectively manage. A single volcanic eruption, by triggering a decade of cold and hunger, exacerbated every existing weakness, contributing to a downward spiral from which the empire never fully recovered. These events, separated by millennia, share a common, humbling lesson. While kings and generals make the decisions that fill our history books, the stage upon which they act is often set by forces far beyond their control. A volcano does not care about battle plans or imperial ambitions. Its ash can starve armies, and its climate shifts can unleash waves of migration that topple thrones. Geology and climate are the silent, long-term players in history. Their slow, immense power capable of triggering wars or causing empires to crumble over decades, not in a single, glorious battle. Even the smallest creature could change the tide of a battle. A disciplined Roman legion, a wall of shields and spears, could be utterly undone not by a rival army, but by a single disturbed beehive. There are numerous accounts from ancient chronicles of swarms of bees descending upon soldiers, their stings creating pure chaos in tightly packed formations. Men who would stand firm against a cavalry charge would break and run, flailing wildly, their armor offering no protection against this buzzing, stinging cloud. The very discipline that made an army strong, its ordered ranks, became its greatest vulnerability. This was not a weapon that could be blocked with a shield or countered with a sword. It was a natural ambush that turned rational soldiers into a panicked mob, rendering any battle plan completely useless. On the other end of the scale were the elephants, the living tanks of the ancient world. These colossal animals could smash through enemy lines, their very appearance sowing terror, but they were also immense, unpredictable forces of nature. A general who brought elephants onto the field was wielding a double-edged sword. If the beasts were frightened by something unexpected, like the sudden crackle of fire or an unfamiliar, piercing war trumpet, they could panic. Turning in a blind frenzy, they would trample their own handlers and crush the soldiers in their own army. The very weapon meant to secure victory could become the instrument of an army's own destruction. Controlling such raw, primal power was a constant gamble, a reminder that taming nature for war was never a sure thing. And sometimes the natural world intervened not with a direct attack, but by simply consuming an army's lifeline. Imagine a vast cloud darkening the sky, not of rain but of locusts. They would descend upon the land, and in a matter of hours, every stalk of grain, every leaf on a tree would be gone. For an army on the march, this was a catastrophe. The supply wagons meant to feed thousands of soldiers were now filled with nothing. Without food, morale would collapse, horses would weaken and die, and the campaign would grind to a starving halt. A locust plague did not need to kill a single soldier to defeat an army. It merely had to eat its dinner. These bizarre but documented events force us to see ancient battlefields not as sterile chessboards, but as living, breathing ecosystems. Every element, from the insects in the air to the largest beasts on the ground, was a potential player in the conflict. The general who understood this, who could read the land and its creatures as well as he could read a map, held a profound and often overlooked advantage. The desert does not forgive mistakes, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men, made a fatal one. In the scorching summer of 53 BCE, his army of over 40,000 men marched into the Mesopotamian sands near the town of Carrhae, confident in the invincibility of the Roman legion. They were met not by a traditional phalanx, but by a swirling cloud of 10,000 Parthian horse archers. These riders employed a devastating tactic, the Parthian shot, galloping away while turning to fire arrows backwards with terrifying accuracy. The Roman testudo, or tortoise formation, a mobile wall of shields that could deflect frontal assaults, became a death trap under the relentless, arcing rain of arrows from all sides. The sun beat down, metal armor became an oven, and the legionaries' thirst grew unbearable. Then, as if the Parthian tactics were not enough, the desert itself seemed to rise against the Romans. Ancient sources hint at something more than just military defeat. They speak of strange, sudden dust storms, great choking clouds of fine sand that swept across the plain. For a force already disoriented, dehydrated, and surrounded, such a storm would have been a final, crushing blow. Visibility would have dropped to zero, commands would have been lost in the howling wind, and formations would have shattered into isolated, panicked groups. The combination of the Parthian arrows and the desert's fury created a perfect storm of annihilation. Croesus was killed, and his army was utterly destroyed, a catastrophic blow to Roman prestige that echoed for generations. But the story of the lost legions does not end on that bloody field. A fascinating legend, whispered along the Silk Road for centuries, suggests that some Roman prisoners, taken captive after the battle, were marched east for years, eventually being enlisted as mercenaries by a Chinese warlord. Some accounts even point to a small town in western China, where archaeological finds and local DNA seem to hint at a possible Roman connection. While most historians view this as compelling folklore rather than settled fact, the enduring mystery itself is a testament to the battle's profound impact. The disaster at Carrhae forces us to ask a difficult question. Was it truly the Parthian cavalry that destroyed Croesus, or was it his own profound arrogance, his dismissal of both his enemy's tactics and the lethal environment he so carelessly entered? The desert sandstorms may have been the final, decisive general on that field, ensuring that a Roman army designed for European forests and hills would be consumed by a landscape it never understood. This is the ultimate lesson of nature in warfare, where the terrain is not just a backdrop, but an active, hostile force waiting for any commander foolish enough to ignore its power. A river can be a road, a moat, or a tomb. For history's greatest commanders, a waterway was the ultimate strategic variable, a line on the map that could be crossed for glory or could suddenly rise up to drown an entire campaign. When Alexander the Great reached the banks of the raging Hydaspes River in India, he faced more than just the army of King Porus on the opposite shore. A torrential downpour had swollen the river, turning it into a boiling, impassable barrier. His cavalry, the heart of his striking force, was useless against the current. In that moment, Alexander was not just fighting a human enemy, he was battling the elements themselves. His genius lay in turning this natural obstacle into a weapon of deception. While his main force created a noisy diversion upstream, Alexander led a smaller, elite contingent on a daring night crossing far downriver, moving through a violent thunderstorm that masked the sound of their movement. His success was a testament to human adaptability in the face of nature's raw power, a victory snatched from the jaws of a flooding river. But for every Alexander who mastered a river, there were countless others who were mastered by one. In China, the Yellow River was not merely a geographical feature, it was a temperamental god. Known as China's sorrow, its course has shifted dramatically over centuries, and its catastrophic floods have rewritten the destiny of empires. An army camped on its banks, confident in its numbers and supplies, could be wiped out in a single night by a wall of water and mud. These floods did not just destroy military formations, they triggered famines that destabilized dynasties, fueling peasant rebellions that toppled governments from within. A ruler who lost the mandate of heaven was often a ruler whose land had been devastated by the Yellow River's uncontrollable fury. The water itself became the executioner of failing regimes. So, was a river a tool or an opponent? The answer is both. It was a highway for supply and movement, a defensive line that could protect a flank, and a source of life for thousands of soldiers. But with a single storm, it could become a devastating, impartial force of destruction, erasing the careful plans of generals as if they were scribbles in the sand. The flow of water and the flow of history are inextricably linked, reminding us that the terrain under an army's feet and the water at its border held a power no less decisive than the sharpest sword. Centuries later, another ancient battlefield witnessed what appeared to be a celestial intervention. The Valley of Jezreel, a broad plain surrounding the fortress of Megiddo, was the stage for a clash between the Israelite forces of the prophetess Deborah and the general Barak, and the formidable Canaanite army with its 900 iron chariots. According to the Song of Deborah in the Book of Judges, the very cosmos entered the fray. The stars fought from heaven, from their courses they fought against Sisera, the Canaanite commander. The song also tells of the torrential Kishon River sweeping away the enemy. Was this merely poetic triumph, or does it describe a real environmental catastrophe that befell the Canaanites? The key to this mystery lies in the geography of the valley itself. The Kishon is not a mighty river, but a seasonal wadi, a riverbed that is typically dry but can become a raging torrent during sudden, heavy downpours. If a violent thunderstorm broke over the hills just as the Canaanites deployed their chariots onto the plain, the results would have been catastrophic. The hard-baked ground would have turned into a treacherous sea of mud, immobilizing the heavy iron-wheeled chariots that were the pride of their army. Chariots stuck in mud are not weapons, they are death traps. The once dry riverbed would have swiftly become a flash flood, sweeping away soldiers and horses caught in its path. This single meteorological event could have transformed the Canaanites' greatest asset into their greatest liability. But what of the stars fighting from heaven? Some scholars propose this could be a description of a meteor shower, a storm of fiery streaks across the night sky. For an army already disoriented by a sudden storm and a collapsing battle line, the sight of the heavens seemingly hurling fire down upon them would have been the final blow to their morale, interpreted as the God of Israel making war against them. The combination of a flash flood on the ground and a celestial light show above would have created a perfect storm of psychological and physical defeat. This interpretation does not diminish the biblical account, it enriches it. It invites us to see the event through the eyes of those who were there, for whom a storm was never just a storm. It was a manifestation of divine power. The victory at Megiddo stands as a powerful example of how a commander's understanding of the local terrain and its weather patterns could be as decisive as any sword, and how a natural phenomenon, when timed with uncanny precision, could rewrite history and be remembered for millennia as the stars themselves going to war. The ground itself can be the most unpredictable general of all. Consider the ancient city of Jericho, its formidable walls standing as an impenetrable barrier to any attacking army. The biblical narrative describes those walls collapsing after the Israelites marched around them, a victory attributed to divine power. Yet modern science offers a compelling parallel explanation. The Jordan Rift Valley, upon which Jericho was built, is a seismically active zone, part of the same tectonic system that runs through the Dead Sea. Geologists note that an earthquake at the right moment could have violently shaken the foundations of Jericho's walls, causing them to crumble inward or collapse outward in a heap of stone and mud. This would not diminish the story's power, but rather reframe it, suggesting that the natural world provided the precise physical mechanism for a pivotal military and spiritual event. The earth, in a single, violent shudder, decided the fate of a city. This pattern of seismic intervention repeats itself across history. In the early 4th century BCE, a massive Persian army was poised to invade and crush the city-state of Sparta. As their fleet gathered for the assault, a catastrophic earthquake struck the region of Laconia. The quake itself was devastating, but its true military impact came from the tsunami it generated. The giant wave smashed into the Persian ships at anchor, obliterating the invasion force before it could even set sail. Sparta was saved not by its legendary hoplites, but by a sudden shift in the Earth's crust, a tectonic event that acted as the city's ultimate and most powerful defender. Centuries later, in the year 365 CE, the entire eastern Mediterranean was rocked by one of the most powerful earthquakes in recorded history. The quake itself was catastrophic, but its aftermath was even more devastating for the Roman Empire. The seismic upheaval triggered a tsunami that raced across the sea, slamming into the city of Alexandria. The great harbor, the lifeblood of Roman Egypt, was destroyed. Warehouses filled with grain were submerged, and the intricate logistics network that fed the empire's legions and its capital city was severed. This was not just a local disaster, it was a systemic shock that crippled military supply lines and exacerbated economic crises, contributing to the empire's growing instability. The lesson from these events is humbling. A commander could plan for every human variable, but he could not plan for the ground to move. An earthquake did not care about battle formations or imperial ambitions. In an instant, it could topple the walls of a city, annihilate an entire fleet, or starve an army by destroying the infrastructure that sustained it. The Earth's stability is an illusion we take for granted, and history shows that when that illusion shatters, the course of human conflict is irrevocably changed. Fog is the great equalizer on the battlefield, a silent ally that can shroud an entire army from view. It earned its reputation as the friend of the weak for a powerful reason, offering a cloak of invisibility to those who were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. During the American Revolution, George Washington's Continental Army faced annihilation by the British at the Battle of Long Island. Trapped with their backs to the East River, defeat seemed inevitable. But then a thick, persistent fog rolled in overnight. Under this natural veil, Washington's men rowed boat after boat across the water, their movements muffled and hidden. By morning, the entire force had vanished, leaving the British to stare into an empty mist. The fog had granted a reprieve that saved the American cause. This tactical use of weather was not a new invention. Centuries earlier, in the Warring States period of ancient China, the general Sun Bin used a similar blanket of fog to orchestrate a masterful ambush at the Battle of Mei Ling. He lured the arrogant Wei army into a narrow pass, and as the fog thickened, he concealed his elite crossbowmen along the high ground. When the Wei forces were fully committed in the confined space, the fog did not just hide the ambush, it amplified the chaos and confusion. The Wei soldiers, unable to see their attackers or the scale of the trap, were cut down in disarray. In both these battles, separated by millennia, commanders understood that fog was more than just weather, it was a tool. It could conceal your weaknesses, mask your intentions, and transform the landscape into a place of uncertainty and terror for your enemy. A clever general learned to listen to the wind and watch the horizon, not just for signs of divine favor, but for practical, tactical opportunities. The greatest weapon sometimes wasn't a sharper sword or a stronger wall, but the very air that made those things impossible to see. Confidence can be the most dangerous weapon an enemy wields against you. For King Croesus of Lydia, whose wealth was so legendary his name became a byword for riches, this overconfidence proved to be his ultimate downfall. He ruled a powerful empire in Anatolia, but a new threat was rising in the east, the expansionist Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Determined to check this rival, Croesus did what any prudent ancient king would do: he sought divine guidance. He sent a magnificent fortune to the oracle at Delphi, the most revered prophetic voice in the ancient world, and asked whether he should march against Persia. The oracle's reply was a masterpiece of ambiguity, stating that if Croesus attacked the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. Interpreting this as a guaranteed victory, Croesus launched his invasion only to be decisively defeated. The great empire that fell was his own. The oracle, it seemed, had spoken a devastating truth cloaked in the king's own assumptions. But the story does not end with a simple lesson about hubris. Interwoven with this famous prophecy is a celestial event that may have sealed Croesus' fate years before the final battle. The Greek historian Herodotus recounts that before the war, a strange darkness fell over the land. We now know a solar eclipse occurred over the region in 585 BCE, the very same eclipse that halted the Battle of the Hollies years prior. For a king like Croesus, this was not an old story, it was a fresh and terrifying memory. How do these two threads, the cryptic oracle and the ominous eclipse, connect? The eclipse likely served as a powerful psychological primer. It was a recent, visceral reminder that the gods could blot out the sun itself, a demonstration of cosmic power that would have made Croesus intensely aware of divine will. When he then received the oracle's vague promise, his mind, already conditioned by the eclipse to look for celestial signs, would have been predisposed to hear only the confirmation of his own desires. The prophecy and the natural phenomenon worked in tandem, one creating a state of heightened suggestibility, the other providing the seemingly divine endorsement for a catastrophic decision. This was not a case of a king being foolish, but of a leader operating within a world view where the natural and supernatural were inseparable. The eclipse was an omen, and the oracle was its interpreter. Croesus made a strategic choice based on what he believed was a complete picture of reality, a picture painted by both priests and the sky itself. His story is a timeless cautionary tale about the peril of interpreting ambiguous signs through the lens of our own ambition, a reminder that the most powerful forces shaping history are sometimes not the armies in the field, but the ideas in a king's mind, placed there by the voices of gods and the silent movements of the heavens. A streak of fire across the night sky was never just a beautiful light show. It was a message, a portent of doom or a promise of glory, and ancient generals hung on every word. Comets, with their long, ethereal tails, were the ultimate celestial messengers, believed to foretell the death of kings and the fall of empires. The most famous example is stitched right into the Bayeux Tapestry, a medieval chronicle of the Norman conquest of England. There, for all to see, is Halley's comet blazing in the sky just before the Battle of Hastings in 1066. To the Anglo-Saxons watching this star with hair, as they called it, it was a terrifying omen of their impending doom. For William the Conqueror and his invading Normans, it was a divine endorsement, a cosmic signal that their cause was just and their victory assured. That single point of light in the tapestry captures a profound psychological truth, a celestial event that bolstered the confidence of one army and sowed despair in the other, perhaps tipping the scales before a single Norman knight ever set foot on English soil. This interpretation of the heavens was a global phenomenon. In ancient China, court astronomers kept meticulous records of every celestial event, believing the sky was a perfect mirror of earthly affairs. A comet appearing in a certain sector of the heavens might signal an uprising in a corresponding province, or a meteor shower might indicate that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven, granting divine permission for rebellion. These were not casual observations, they were critical intelligence reports. A general planning a campaign would delay his march or accelerate his attack based on the reading of the stars. The appearance of a comet could provide the perfect propaganda to rally troops, convincing them that the very universe was on their side. The enemy, hearing the same reports, might be paralyzed by fear, their will to fight eroded by the belief that they were opposing a cosmic decree. Scientifically, of course, a comet's path is a matter of predictable orbital mechanics, and a meteor shower is simply the Earth passing through the debris trail of a comet. They are random in terms of human history, utterly indifferent to our wars and our rulers, yet their impact was undeniably real. How can we reconcile this? The answer lies in the power of belief to shape reality. When a commander sees a favorable omen, he acts with unshakable confidence, making bolder moves and inspiring greater fervor in his men. When his opponent sees the same omen and believes it spells his ruin, he becomes hesitant, fearful, and prone to error. The omen becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The cosmic event itself does not win the battle, but the human reaction to it very often does. A shooting star was not a physical weapon, but the idea of that shooting star could demoralize a legion, embolden an army, and ultimately change the course of a war, proving that sometimes the most powerful force on any battlefield was the story people told themselves about the sky above them. A general's grand strategy could be undone by something as simple as a late rain. The entire rhythm of ancient warfare was dictated not by political ambition, but by the agricultural cycle, a calendar written in soil and seasons. Armies were, first and foremost, vast collections of hungry mouths, and the success of any campaign hinged on a simple, brutal equation: was there enough food to feed them? This fundamental truth meant that war itself had a season. It began after the harvest, when granaries were full, and the farmers who made up the bulk of any fighting force were temporarily freed from their fields. To launch an invasion before the crops were in was to invite immediate disaster, a lesson the Romans learned through hard experience. During their long struggle against Carthage, the Punic Wars, Roman consuls knew their window for military action was narrow. A campaign launched too early risked leaving the homeland starved and vulnerable, while a late start could mean getting bogged down by autumn rains or winter snows. The entire military machine, from the legions in the field to the senators in Rome, waited on the success of the harvest. A single drought could empty the treasury more effectively than any enemy raid, forcing the delay or outright cancellation of a planned invasion. Conversely, a year of perfect weather and a bumper crop was like a massive infusion of military funding. Surplus grain meant you could keep your soldiers in the field longer, project power further, and sustain a war of attrition that would break a less fortunate rival. This deep, inseparable link between the plow and the sword meant that the farmer, quietly tending his field, was as vital to victory as the general drawing up battle plans. The land itself was the ultimate quartermaster, and its favor, or its fury, decided the fate of empires long before the first spear was ever thrown. A profound darkness fell over Jerusalem in the middle of the day. As recorded in the Gospels, this unexpected event coincided with the crucifixion of Jesus, a moment of deep spiritual significance that also rippled through the tense political air of Roman-occupied Judea. For the followers of Jesus, this darkness was a sign of divine mourning. For the Roman authorities, it was something else entirely, a potential trigger for instability in a province perpetually on the brink of revolt. Such an event, whether a solar eclipse or a sudden, intense dust storm, was never just a weather report. In the ancient world, daytime darkness was a clear omen, a signal that the gods were displeased. For Pontius Pilate and his garrison, the primary concern was maintaining order. A supernatural darkness could easily be interpreted by the local population as a divine judgment against Rome itself, a catalyst for the very rebellions they worked so hard to suppress. The timing could not have been more politically charged. We can look to the historical record for clues. The Greek historian Phlegon, writing in the 2nd century, documented a strange event during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. He notes a solar eclipse so great that stars were seen in the sky at the 6th hour, which aligns strikingly with the biblical account of darkness from the 6th to the 9th hour. Using modern astronomical retrocalculation, scientists have identified a potential candidate, a total solar eclipse that passed over the region in 29 CE. This date falls perfectly within the possible time frame of the crucifixion, But could a solar eclipse really cause 3 hours of darkness? A total eclipse blackens the sky for only a few minutes, not hours. This discrepancy has led to another compelling theory, one rooted in the local environment. The region is prone to violent sandstorms known as Comets, winds that can carry vast clouds of dust from the Arabian desert, blotting out the sun for hours and turning day into an eerie, suffocating twilight. A major Comets storm, occurring on the same day as a partial solar eclipse, would create a phenomenon of prolonged, terrifying darkness, a 1-2 punch from the natural world that would feel undeniably supernatural to everyone who witnessed it. Imagine the scene in Jerusalem. The sky turns an ominous copper color, then pitch black. The air grows thick with dust. In the political tension of occupied Judea, such an event was a loaded weapon. It would have emboldened zealot rebels who saw it as God's promise to smite their oppressors. It would have shaken the faith of those Jews who collaborated with Rome. Most importantly, it would have supercharged the fledgling Christian movement, providing a powerful, tangible sign that the cosmos itself testified to the significance of the man on the cross. This single afternoon of darkness did not just fulfill a prophecy, it ignited a spiritual revolution that would eventually challenge the very foundations of the Roman Empire. The sky over Golgotha reminds us that a natural event, filtered through the lens of faith and politics, can alter the course of human history far beyond the battlefield, shaping empires from the inside out. The ocean's tides are a slow, predictable breath, but in war, that steady rhythm could become a weapon. Centuries before the second Kamikaze storm, another civilization turned water into a wall. In ancient Egypt, the enigmatic Sea Peoples, a coalition of raiders from the north, threatened to overwhelm the Nile Delta with their formidable fleet. The Egyptian pharaoh, Ramses III, did not merely meet them on the open water. He used the river itself as his strategic ally. He lured the invaders into the confined channels of the delta, and then, with a masterful understanding of the Nile's seasonal floods and complex currents, he sprung his trap. The Egyptians positioned their own ships to block escape routes, and as the river's flow worked to their advantage, the Sea People's vessels were hemmed in, unable to maneuver. They were trapped and systematically destroyed, their invasion shattered by a commander who knew his home waters would fight for him. This was not a freak storm, but a deliberate application of environmental knowledge, a planned use of the river's own power to amplify a smaller navy's strength. That same principle of local mastery decided one of history's most famous naval engagements. At the Battle of Salamis, the massive Persian fleet sought to crush the outnumbered Greek navy in the narrow straits. The Athenian commander, Themistocles, knew those waters intimately. He understood the local currents and the daily wind patterns. He used this knowledge to bait the Persians into the tightest part of the channel, and at the critical moment, the sea itself seemed to turn against the invaders. The bulky Persian ships, crowded together, struggled against the currents and fell into disarray, while the lighter, more agile Greek triremes, built for those very conditions, darted in and out with devastating effect. The Greeks did not just have better sailors, they had a better relationship with the sea, a partnership forged from daily life and strategic observation. And then, of course, there was the ocean's ultimate, untamable fury. The Mongols, humiliated by the first Kamikaze, returned to Japan 7 years later with an even larger armada. They had learned from their initial failure, building sturdier ships and planning for a longer campaign, but the sea had a different lesson to teach. Once again, as their fleet lay poised for invasion, a typhoon of unimaginable force descended upon them. This second divine wind was, if anything, more destructive than the first, shattering the new fleet and drowning the hopes of Kublai Khan forever. For the Japanese, it was an undeniable confirmation of their sacred status. For the Mongols, it was a stark reminder that no amount of human engineering could command the raw power of the open ocean. These stories, from the Nile to Salamis to the coast of Japan, share a common thread. The sea was not a blank slate for battle, but a living, breathing participant. It rewarded those who listened to its whispers, who learned its rhythms and respected its moods. A general could command an army, but to command the respect of the sea was to hold a strategic advantage that no number of ships could ever guarantee. A commander's most potent weapon was often not his army, but the fear already lurking in the enemy's mind. Ancient leaders were brilliant psychologists who understood that a shared belief in omens could be manipulated, turning the natural world into a theater of terror. The Romans perfected this art. If their spies learned that an opposing culture feared a particular celestial event, they might deliberately schedule their assault to coincide with that very omen. Imagine the scene: a foreign army watches the sun vanish, interpreting it as a sign their gods have abandoned them, and at that precise moment of maximum despair, the Roman legions appear from the gloom, their armor glinting in the unnatural twilight. The enemy's will to fight could evaporate before a single sword was drawn. Hannibal Barca executed an even more direct form of environmental warfare during his legendary crossing of the Alps. He did not just endure the mountain storms, he used them. As his Carthaginian army and their war elephants navigated the treacherous passes, he turned the environment itself against the pursuing Romans and the hostile local tribes. Avalanches triggered by his men or by the harsh weather were not just obstacles, they were weapons. The thunder of falling snow and rock was a psychological sledgehammer, demoralizing those who believed the mountains were an impassable divine wall. For the Romans, hearing reports of an enemy who could command the very mountains to fight for him created an aura of invincibility around Hannibal before he even set foot in Italy. This manipulation worked on both sides of the battle line. A general had to carefully manage his own troops' superstitions as well. A sudden eclipse could panic his own men just as easily as the enemy's. The real skill lay in the narrative, in immediately framing the event. A great leader would stand before his terrified soldiers and declare the darkened sun was a sign their enemy's patron god had been defeated, or that the moon had blotted out the sun in mourning for the foes they were about to slay. It was a race to control the story, and the commander who won that race could transform a potential rout into a surge of divine certainty. The most fearsome army in the world was useless if its soldiers believed they were fighting against the heavens themselves, proving that the most decisive terrain in any war was the landscape of the human mind. Even the honk of a goose can echo through history. In the dead of night around 390 BCE, a Gallic army had shattered the main Roman defenses and was scaling the Capitoline Hill, the last bastion of the city. The defenders, exhausted and unaware, were asleep. According to the Roman historian Livy, it was not a soldier who sounded the alarm, but the sacred geese of the goddess Juno. Their frantic cackling and flapping woke the former consul Marcus Manlius, who rushed to the wall and hurled the first Gaul back over the precipice, rallying the Romans to save their citadel. This is the legend of the Capitoline geese, a story that celebrates animal instinct and divine favor. Yet, other ancient accounts weave a different element into this dramatic rescue, a sudden and violent thunderstorm that erupted as the Gauls made their final assault. Could these two narratives, the animal and the atmospheric, be parts of a single, forgotten truth? The Gallic attack was a season of terror for Rome. After a decisive defeat at the Battle of the Allia, the Roman army had disintegrated, leaving the city virtually undefended. the Gauls, led by the chieftain Brennus, looted and burned much of Rome before turning their attention to the fortified capital. A long siege began. The Gauls, masters of open warfare, grew frustrated with the stalemate. They decided on a risky night attack, scaling the steep cliffs of the hill that the Romans considered unassailable. This is the precise moment where history and meteorology might collide. Imagine the scene from the Gallic perspective. You are climbing a sheer rock face in darkness, your hands and feet searching for holds. The only sounds are your own labored breathing and the faint noises of the sleeping city above. Then, without warning, the geese begin to shriek. Almost simultaneously, the sky explodes. A sudden, torrential downpour begins, and the rock face you are clinging to becomes a slick, treacherous waterfall. Lightning flashes, illuminating your position to the now alerted defenders on the walls above. The wind howls, making it difficult to hear commands or maintain your balance. In this chaos, the combination of the animal alarm and the storm's fury would have been utterly devastating. The geese, highly sensitive to changes in barometric pressure, might have been agitated by the approaching storm itself, their honks serving as an unintended alarm triggered by the very weather that would soon aid the Romans. The sudden storm, then, was not just a backdrop to the Geishis' heroics, it was an active participant. It turned a difficult climb into a suicidal one. It masked the sounds of the Roman counterattack and amplified the confusion among the Gauls. This intertwining of animal lore and natural event created the perfect foundation for a national myth. The Romans could attribute their salvation to the divine protection of Juno, whose sacred animals had given the warning. The storm could be seen as Jupiter himself, the king of the gods, hurling his thunderbolts at the invaders. This layered story, combining the tangible with the divine, was far more powerful for building a collective identity than a simple tale of a lucky rain shower. It cemented the idea that Rome was not just protected by its soldiers, but by its gods and the very forces of nature. So, did the geese save Rome, or did the storm? The most compelling answer is that they both did. The legend of the Capitoline geese endures not merely as a charming fable, but as a profound reminder of how our ancestors saw no separation between the animal world, the weather, and the divine. In their view, the universe was a connected whole, and a squawking bird could be the voice of a coming tempest, and a summer storm could be the hand of a god, together writing a crucial, unexpected chapter in the story of a republic that would one day rule the world. A silent killer followed the Roman legions home. In the late 2nd century, soldiers returning from campaigns in the Near East brought back a grim souvenir, a devastating illness history calls the Antonine Plague. Likely smallpox, this disease ripped through the Roman Empire with a ferocity that no foreign army could match. It did not just sicken the population, it targeted the very heart of Roman power, its military. Legionary forts, with their close quarters and constant movement of troops, became perfect incubators. The army that had pacified continents was now being decimated from within, its ranks thinning at a rate that no recruitment drive could possibly hope to replace. This invisible enemy eroded the empire's ability to defend its vast borders, creating vulnerabilities that would be exploited for generations to come. The plague contributed to a period of severe political and economic instability known as the Crisis of the 3rd century, a time when the empire nearly tore itself apart. A similar story unfolded centuries later in the Eastern Mediterranean. The great powers of the age, the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persians, were locked in a brutal war. Their armies clashed outside the walls of Constantinople, but the real stalemate was imposed by an unseen force, The Plague of Justinian, a horrific early wave of the bubonic plague, swept through both camps without favor. It did not matter which emperor you served, the microscopic enemy Yersinia Pestis was utterly impartial. Soldiers on both sides fell victim to the telltale buboes, the violent fevers, and the rapid, gruesome death. The siege became unsustainable, not because of military defeat, but because there were simply not enough healthy men left to hold a line or mount an assault. The ambitions of two empires were neutralized not by strategy but by biology. How did these diseases travel so effectively? They were master stowaways. The very networks that built and supplied empires, the intricate web of trade routes and military supply lines, became superhighways for pathogens. A merchant carrying silk from China could also be carrying a deadly virus. A soldier marching from Egypt to Gaul brought more than his kit. He brought every microbe he had encountered along the way. An army on the march was a city in motion, and it carried its own invisible, lethal baggage. This reveals a profound irony of ancient warfare. A commander could build the strongest walls and forge the sharpest swords, but his greatest vulnerability was the breath of his own soldiers. The most decisive campaigns were often ended not by the enemy on the battlefield, but by the microscopic world that traveled with them, reshaping the map through the relentless, invisible logic of disease. The sky above Constantinople burned with an unearthly light. In the year 540, as the Emperor Justinian struggled to hold his fractured empire together against war and a devastating plague, a strange celestial fire was seen over the city. Byzantine chroniclers described it not as a star, but as a great glowing spear or a fiery portent hanging in the heavens. For a population already living in fear, this was not a simple atmospheric curiosity, it was a direct message. The question was from whom and what did it mean? Some soldiers and citizens desperate for hope may have seen it as a divine banner, a sign that God had not abandoned them in their darkest hour. For others, gripped by the terror of the Justinianic plague, that same light could have been a sword of judgment, a fiery omen foretelling more death and defeat. This single, unexplained phenomenon became a Rorschach test in the sky, its interpretation shaped entirely by the fear and faith of the person looking up. So what was this fiery sign? Modern astronomers and historians have proposed several compelling scientific explanations. The description of a luminous spear or a glowing path aligns closely with a vivid aurora borealis. While rare so far south, intense solar activity can sometimes push the northern lights into Mediterranean latitudes, creating a spectacular, rippling curtain of color that would have been utterly alien to 6th century observers. Another strong possibility is a particularly brilliant meteor, a bolide entering the atmosphere at a shallow angle. Such an event can create a long, slow, and intensely bright trail that seems to hang in the sky for minutes, perfectly matching the chronicle of a fiery spear. There is also a third, more ominous candidate, a comet. Historical records from China and elsewhere note a comet appearing in the mid-530s, which could have been visible from Constantinople. A comet's steady, lingering glow would have been a persistent reminder of cosmic disquiet, night after night. The true power of this event, however, lies not in its astronomical classification, but in its timing. It occurred when the empire was at a precipice. Justinian's armies were fighting on multiple fronts, and the plague was ravaging the city, killing thousands. In this climate of crisis, a strange light in the sky was never just a light. It was evidence. For a general, it could be the morale boost needed to rally his beleaguered troops, convincing them heaven was on their side. For the enemy, it could be a psychological weapon, a sign that the very heavens opposed their campaign. the narrative of the event, whether it was framed as a blessing or a curse, became a tangible force, as real as any legion or plague bacterium. The fiery sky over Constantinople forces us to consider a profound truth about the ancient world, where the line between a natural event and a supernatural message was invisible. A flicker of light in the atmosphere could tilt the outcome of a war, not by striking anyone down, but by changing the story in the hearts and minds of those who fought it. The profession of the augur was a cornerstone of state authority. In Rome, no public business, least of all war, could proceed without the favorable reading of the auspices. A specially appointed priest would carefully observe the flight patterns of birds, the feeding habits of sacred chickens, or the patterns of lightning in the sky. Every squawk and every flash was a syllable in the language of the gods. A general poised to march his legions across a river would halt his entire army if the birds flew from the left, the sinister side, a dire warning that the gods opposed the action. This was not a suggestion, it was a legally binding decree. The most crucial reading often came from the tripudium, the sacred chicken divination. The birds were kept in a cage and offered food before a battle. If they ate so greedily that bits of food fell from their beaks and hit the ground, the omen was excellent, a sign of divine approval that sent a surge of confidence through the ranks. But if the chickens refused to eat, the entire military operation, no matter how strategically vital, could be postponed for days. The story is told of a Roman consul during the Punic Wars who grew frustrated with his sacred chickens refusing to eat before a crucial naval battle. Defiant, he is said to have thrown the birds overboard, declaring if they will not eat, then let them drink. He engaged the enemy and suffered a catastrophic defeat, a lesson hammered home for generations that to ignore the augurs was to invite disaster. This deep-seated system makes the story of Julius Caesar so powerfully resonant. On his way to the Senate on the Ides of March, he encountered the seer Spurina, who had previously warned him of great danger that would last no later than that very day. Caesar, in a moment of fatal hubris, joked that the Ides of March had come, implying the warning was empty. Spurina famously replied, "They have come, but they have not gone." Caesar proceeded to his assassination, a stark lesson in the consequences of dismissing the interpreters of nature's signs. For the ancient mind, the soothsayer's tent was not a place of superstition, but the command center for divine intelligence. The augur did not create the message, he merely translated it from the world the gods had created. A twisted liver from a sacrificed sheep, a flock of birds scattering in panic, a sudden bolt of lightning from a clear sky. These were not random events. They were the direct, unambiguous feedback from the cosmos, and the general who listened held the key not just to victory, but to survival itself. The 9th Legion was a hardened force of Roman power, a 5,000-strong pillar of imperial might stationed at the northern edge of the known world. Then, around 108 CE, it simply vanished from all official records. No grand battle is chronicled, no heroic last stand is celebrated in Roman histories. The legion, known as Hispana, just disappears, leaving behind one of history's most tantalizing riddles. The popular imagination, fueled by stories and film, often paints a picture of the legion marching into the Scottish mists to be annihilated by fierce Caledonian tribes. Yet, the archaeological record tells a more ambiguous and perhaps more frightening story. There is no mass grave, no battlefield strewn with the distinctive armor of the 9th. Their sudden absence points to a far more silent and efficient destroyer. Could nature itself have swallowed this legendary military unit whole? The province of Britannia was a hostile posting, a land of damp cold and thick forests. A legion's strength relied on its intricate logistics, the supply trains that brought grain from the continent and equipment from the south. What if that lifeline was severed not by human raiders, but by a freak event? A colossal storm in the North Sea, for instance, could have sunk the entire fleet of ships carrying a year's worth of food, weapons, and pay for the legion. Stranded at their fortress in York, the soldiers would have faced a slow, grim descent into starvation and disorder, their discipline crumbling as hunger set in. Without supplies, they could not maintain their fortifications or mount effective campaigns, making them easy prey for the very tribes they were meant to subdue. Or perhaps a more insidious enemy found its way into the barracks. The cramped, unsanitary conditions of a Roman fort were a perfect breeding ground for disease. An outbreak of plague, similar to the Antonine Plague that would later ravage the empire, could have swept through the ninth with terrifying speed. In a matter of weeks, a force of thousands could be reduced to a handful of terrified survivors, too few to maintain the legion's identity. The Roman military bureaucracy, faced with such a catastrophic and ignoble loss, might have simply disbanded the remnants and erased the legion from the rolls, a silent admission of a defeat handed to them not by a worthy enemy, but by a microscopic foe. The mystery of the Ninth Legion endures because its end lacks the closure of a traditional battle. The absence of evidence is the most compelling clue, pointing away from a single, glorious conflict and toward the slow, grinding power of the natural world. It forces us to consider that the greatest threat to a disciplined army was not always another army, but the simple, relentless indifference of the environment it tried to conquer. The fate of empires was often sealed not in a single battle, but by a slow, creeping change in the weather. Across the ancient world, the rise and fall of civilizations can be mapped not just by the reigns of kings, but by centuries-long shifts in climate, a concept historians call climatic determinism. Paleoclimatology, the science of studying ancient climates, provides the evidence, reading the history of the atmosphere in tree rings, ice cores, and sediment layers. These natural archives reveal a dramatic story. The mighty Akkadian Empire, which once united Mesopotamia, did not simply fall to a rival army. Around 4,200 years ago, a prolonged and catastrophic drought gripped the region, a mega-drought that lasted for over a century. The very lifeblood of the empire, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, dwindled. Farmlands that fed the cities turned to dust, and the intricate network of canals and irrigation that supported Akkadian power simply dried up. This environmental collapse triggered mass migrations, social unrest, and a desperate fight for dwindling resources, shattering the empire from within and leaving its cities abandoned to the desert sands. Invaders may have delivered the final blow, but the climate had already written the empire's death sentence. This pattern repeated on a staggering scale just over 1,000 years later. Around 1200 BCE, the entire eastern Mediterranean world experienced a systemic collapse, an event known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. The great empires of the Hittites, the Mycenaean Greeks, and the powerful city-states of Canaan all fell into ruin within a remarkably short period. For a long time, historians pointed to mysterious sea peoples as the primary cause, but modern science suggests a more complex and terrifying scenario, a perfect storm of calamities. Paleoclimate data from the region indicates a period of severe and prolonged drought coincided with this collapse. This drought would have caused widespread crop failure and famine, weakening the population and straining the complex economic systems that held these empires together. At the same time, geological evidence points to a spike in seismic activity, a wave of earthquakes that would have destroyed fortified cities and vital infrastructure. Imagine a world where the fields are barren, the storehouses are empty, and then the very ground begins to shake your walls down. This combination of environmental stresses created a critical vulnerability. The movements of the Sea Peoples were likely not the cause of the collapse, but a symptom of it: desperate migrations of populations who were themselves fleeing their own climate-ruined homelands. When they descended upon the weakened and starving empires of the Eastern Mediterranean, they were not an unstoppable force, but the final push that toppled a structure already rotten at its foundation. This grand climatic perspective forces a humbling realization. The grand narratives of history, the stories of kings and conquests we read in textbooks, are often just the surface drama. Beneath it all, the slow, immense rhythms of the planet's climate set the stage, creating the conditions for glory or dictating the moment of ruin. Armies and emperors were merely actors performing a script written by the wind and the rain.